name is Mark Lender, and I'll be presenting your lecture today. It's called The Usual Suspects, George Washington, His Critics, and the Conway Cabal Reconsidered. The Conway Cabal was the ostensible plot to remove George Washington from his command of the Continental Army, and this took place between December of 1777 and the early spring of 1778. It's roughly the time of the Valley Forge winter. The time, of course, when George Washington had a lot on his hands, and the last thing he needed was a political challenge to his command. The Conway Cabal itself has been something of a historical controversy. Through the 19th century, most historians believe that it was real, that George Washington, in fact, faced a very serious threat to his command, not only of the Continental Army, but his chief position in directing the Patriot War effort against them. But in 1940, a very fine scholar, Bernard Nolenberg, looked at the entire question in a new book on Washington and the Revolution and concluded that there really wasn't any evidence to compel anybody to believe that George Washington was really under a particularly serious threat. Sure, there were critics, but they were mostly carping critics who were annoying, but not really a threat. Well, I'm going to try to convince you today that the history since 1940 on this question, in fact, has been wrong. I will argue that, in fact, the Conway Cabal was quite real, that the threat George Washington faced to his command was broad and deep. It had a lot of support in Congress, in the officer corps, and in the public generally. Now, this is the question we're going to be considering. Was or was not the Conway Cabal the threat to his command that George Washington certainly did think that it was? And if you'll give me just a second or two here, I will call up a PowerPoint presentation and try to walk us through what actually happened in 1777 and 1778. What you see is the so-called Valley Forge portrait of George Washington by Charles Willson Peale. During the Valley Forge winter, Peale painted any number of Continental officers, including Washington. And the reason I show you this portrait is that this is about as close as we're really going to get to what George Washington actually looked like during the episode we're going to be discussing. Now, why the usual suspect? Why do we need to look at this? Well, this is an example of how scholarship leads to scholarship. Several years ago, a friend of mine and I, Gary Wheeler Stone, wrote a book called Fatal Sunday. There's the cover to the right of the screen. And we looked at the Monmouth campaign, particularly the politics of the Monmouth campaign. And we concluded that it was this campaign that really allowed Washington to solidify his command of the Continental Army, because we found that the critics of Washington, in fact, had some traction. We weren't ready to conclude that the Conway Cabal was particularly real, but nevertheless, it was enough to distract Washington from more important things, and what he needed was a victory, and Monmouth gave it to him and allowed him to in essence, shut up those who were criticizing his command. I want to read you something right now. This is a letter from George Washington to his friend Landon Carter. Carter was another member of the Virginia social elite, a very close friend of George Washington. They had corresponded periodically over the war years, and this is from late May of 1778. Washington taking a few minutes of his very harried time. Spare minutes were relatively rare for the man. But he wrote a letter to Carter that was sort of an unburdening. He could say to Carter what he could not say to more casual acquaintances. But listen to this. That there was a scheme, he wrote, see me superseded in my command admits of no doubt. Now, that's a pretty definite statement, and while Washington didn't name names, it's pretty clear that the men he was talking about was Major General Horatio Gates, the victor of the Battle of Saratoga, in which the British held to surrender an entire army, and Major Generals Thomas Mifflin and Thomas Conway, the usual suspects. And when the conspiracy came to light, again, I'm quoting from Washington's letter, the plotters slunk back, disavowed the measure, and professed themselves my warmest admirers. Now, Washington told Carter that he, as far as he knew, he still enjoyed the confidence of Congress, but his implication was that the matter was not really settled. Which brings us back to a question that Gary Stone and I raised in Chapter 2 of Fatal Sunday. Was the Conway cabal real? Was there a serious effort to replace Washington with Major General Horatio Gates? There was. What was the nature of this cabal? Who was involved? What did they try to do? And after considering these questions, I said, well, it's time for a new look, and that meant a new book. Now, to understand where Washington's critics were coming from, we've got to just reprise very briefly Washington's record as a commander by late 1777. And as most of you know, it was not impressive. He was beaten at Brandywine. He had a major part of his army under Anthony Wayne surprised at Paoli, and just a really grisly bayonet attack, surprise attack by the British. Washington's counterattack at Germantown in October of 1777 was frustrated, and in November, which for many patriots was just sort of the final straw, Washington was unable to hold the Delaware River forts. There were forts on both sides of the Delaware below Philadelphia, Fort Mifflin on the Pennsylvania side, Fort Mercer on the New Jersey side. In the river itself were obstructions to block British shipping. The plan was, or the hope was, that these forts could hold out until the Delaware River froze over. Would have made the British hold on occupied Philadelphia rather tenuous. Philadelphia could have become a vast prison camp. Royal Navy would not have been able to supply the British in the city. Howe probably would have, General William Howe, who had taken the city in September, probably would have had to pull out, and that would have been a major morale boost. But in November, both Forts Mercer and Fort Mifflin, they didn't fall. They were evacuated, and the British had uncontested control. Now, if you've got a losing general, what do? Well, you consider replacing him. And there was an alternative, and it was Major General Horatio Gates. And we've got to talk about Gates seriously for a moment. Since the Revolution, Gates has had a difficult time with history, and history generally has not been kind to the men. In 1780, at the Battle of Camden, he fought a very bad battle. His army was largely destroyed. His military reputation went up in smoke and never really recovered. But in 1777, which is the perspective in which we've got to put on this, Horatio Gates was a genuine American hero, and deservedly so. It was at Saratoga that he fought Lieutenant General John Burgoyne to a standstill, ultimately compelled Burgoyne to surrender. Now, I'm not going to get into who deserves what sort of credit at Saratoga. I know it's a controversial question, some giving the credit to Gates, others insisting no, it was Schuyler and Benedict Arnold who had really, Schuyler who had laid the groundwork for the eventual victory, Arnold who did the actual fighting. And historians go back and forth on that, and it's sort of a hot potato right now. What is not in any doubt is that after Saratoga, Gates was the hero that many Americans were looking for. And he was not a lightweight. You've got to get that on the table as well. He had a good record as a veteran of the British Army. Before the war, he immigrated to what became the United States shortly before. the American Revolution. He declared early for the Patriot side. He had skills. He did have a combat record in the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, but he had skills in Army administration that the Americans lacked as they formed the Continental Army. He knew how to move paper. It's not the sexiest part of military history, admittedly, but it's that back office kind of stuff, how to run logistics operations, how to keep accurate military records, how to draft orders that people could understand, how to keep the wheels of Army administration moving, and Gates was extremely good at that. Early in the war, he served as Washington's adjutant general, and it was the adjutant general who was in charge of that sort of thing. He was the administrative guy behind Washington, the commander in chief, and Washington genuinely appreciated what Gates did. Gates had always wanted a field command. There was no military glory in pushing paper. What pushing that paper really was. And it was at Saratoga that Gates felt that he had come into his own. And there's no question that people were making comparisons between Washington's defeats and tough luck around Philadelphia in late 1777 and Gates's performance to the north at Saratoga in the autumn of 1777 at just the same time when Washington was running into trouble. It was inevitable that those comparisons would favor Gates. So Washington had his critics, and we should not be surprised. But that leads to questions for us as well. Uh, were these serious critics? I mean, were these people who mattered? Uh, and we've got to answer yes. Now, there is a group of portraits to the right of your screen. The left-hand side, starting at the top, that's Benjamin Rush. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, an ardent patriot, a man who spent a good deal of the time risking his life on behalf of the revolution. He did accompany the army in the field as a doctor. He was one of the more accomplished physicians of his age. There's an entire story on him that is beyond our ken today, but this was an important man. This, again, was not a lightweight. Directly below Benjamin Rush is Richard Henry Lee. Now, this is the man who sponsored the resolution in Congress for the colonies to declare their independence. I mean, it would be difficult to find a more committed revolutionary. Directly below him is Anthony Wayne. Anthony Wayne, a well-known soldier. My guess is that most of you have heard of Anthony Wayne. But by late 1777, he was simply tired of losing battles, and he wrote to Horatio Gates saying as much, that he was really hoping that Gates would become more engaged in managing the war effort. Up on top to the right of Benjamin Rush's portrait is Daniel Broadhead. Daniel Broadhead was an accomplished commander, one who ultimately received a great deal of Washington's trust. But in 1777, late in the year, he is writing to Horatio Gates, saying that many officers are disappointed and disgruntled under Washington's command. They wanted to serve under Gates. Go immediately to Broadhead's right. That's of New Jersey, a congressman who had his sons prisoners of war, but he was critical of Washington. He was simply upset and represented a good deal of what was going on in Congress. Why isn't Washington winning this war? We hired him to win. What do we do? Down below him is Thomas Mifflin, a man we're going to spend a lot of time talking. He was originally very close to Washington. He was a major general by 1777. In late 1776, he became alarmed after some of Washington's losses, and he began to lose faith in the general. He was quartermaster general. This was a man in charge of moving the army, making sure supplies reached the army on time. His performance was problematic. He had originally a close relationship with Washington, but it began to cool, not only on the basis of his performance as quartermaster general, but he also was resentful of the rise of Nathaniel Greene in Washington's estimation. And as Greene's influence with Washington rose, Thomas Mifflin's began to decline. So he had a personal beef with Greene, and he resented Washington's listening to Greene. And at the bottom, we have Samuel Adams, one of the more zealous revolutionaries, who became an acerbic critic of Washington leadership. But again, we have to keep in mind, these men were patriots. And while Samuel Adams is criticizing Washington, his son was an Army doctor who spent a lot of time close to the action, served gallantly at Monmouth, doing the best they could for the wounded just behind the lines. These are men who did not want to lose that war, and they were afraid that Washington was losing. There were two arguments. One was the obvious one, that Washington was not winning his battles. That's why you hire a general. The other was that Washington wanted to build a strong, regular continental army, and people like Benjamin Rush, Samuel Adams, simply didn't believe in it. They believed in an army of militia, and Washington thought militia was simply not up to the task of winning the war. So there was that argument and the argument of Washington's military competence that was weighing against the general. And we have to put this in the context of the day as well, because there was military history to consider. And the colonials were well aware of what their experience had been during the 7 Years' War, which they called the French and Indian War. Historians, American historians, the French and Indian War. And that was this: losing generals, losing commanders in chief did not keep their jobs. One by one, Prime Minister William Pitt of Great Britain fired generals who did not win, one after another, until they finally hit Jeffrey Amherst, who proved to be a war winner. But even Amherst, thinking he was going to be called a hero going home, faced political criticism because he didn't make peace with the Indians and he didn't produce some of the political results that the British were expecting. Congress was fully aware of this, and they discussed this on the floor of the Continental Congress at the time when Washington was under fire. And there is the question, could the Patriots fire a commander-in-chief? Well, the answer is not only yes, but they did fire. Keep in mind that Washington was not the only commander-in-chief. The Continental Navy had its own commander-in-chief, and that was Essex Hopkins. For reasons that we don't have time to go into today, Hopkins did not produce satisfactory military results. He did not have the political friends that Washington ultimately found that he had. And the commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy was relieved of his. So the precedent was there in British military history, and very recent. The Americans were aware of it from the French and Indian War, and they took the measure of firing the commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy. The question was, would they trade Washington for her? Now, two generals in particular certainly would have, the two Thomases, Thomas Mifflin and Thomas Conway. Conway wrote a relatively famous or infamous, depending upon your point of view, letter to Horatio Gates in November of 1777. And it may be too small on your screen for you to read. I'll read it very quickly. This was discovered by accident. I'll explain that in a second. But here is what Conway allegedly wrote to Horatio Gates. Heaven has been determined to save your country, for a weak general and bad counselors would have ruined. Now, this was a private letter, and if it had never come to light, it would have meant nothing at all. But it did come to light. One of the more bizarre stories to come out of the American Revolution. It was a young aide, James Wilkinson, who did actually fairly well as an aide to Gates during the Battle of Saratoga, and was given the honor of conveying the official dispatch from Gates to Congress announcing the surrender of John Burgoyne's army. Now, Washington was slighted by this. He was commander-in-chief, and technically that dispatch should have come to him, not directly to Congress. Washington took it as an insult, but he didn't say anything. But during his trip to Congress from Saratoga, Wilkinson made a stop at the headquarters. It's bad weather, nasty weather, so he pulled up at the headquarters of another general, a Washington loyalist, William Alexander of New Jersey, better known as Lord Stirling. He claimed a Scottish earldom. And he got to drinking with two of the aides of Stirling and Stirling himself. When Stirling went to bed, Wilkinson continued to talk with these aides, one of whom was James Monroe, the future president. And they all had, frankly, entirely too much to drink. And Wilkinson divulged what he had seen in the letter. And this is the quote, this heaven has been determined quote, that he told these aides to Stirling about. Next morning, Wilkinson rode off to Congress, and the aides, of course, went in and told General Stirling, Lord Stirling, what they had heard, and Stirling, of course, conveyed it to Washington. And Washington, well, to say he was not happy, to put it mildly. He confronted Gates with this. He confronted Conway with this, he being Washington. And so now this criticism that Washington felt was building, as far as he was concerned, was now out in the open. He had Gates linked to someone who was willing to write something like this. Actually, a really damning letter was not Conway's, but it was Mifflin's. Mifflin, Quartermaster General of the Army, former close aide to Washington, wrote to Gates, also in the middle of November, and this letter was genuinely a bombshell, or it would have been a bombshell if it had gone public. But it gives us a very, very clear view of what the really serious critics of Washington were. I'll read this quickly as well. This is writing to Gates in the immediate, within a month after the surrender of Burgoyne. You have saved our northern hemisphere, and in spite of our consummate and repeated blundering, you have changed the constitution of the Southern campaign on the part of the enemy from offensive to defensive. In short, this army will be totally lost unless you come down and collect the virtuous band who wish to fight under your banner, and with their aid save the Southern hemisphere. Congress must send. In other words, Horatio, come down from the north, come south, take command down here, and rectify this situation. But these were letters, private letters to Gates. Does that constitute a plot? Was there really a plot? And the question is, who thought so among Washington's partisans? Yes, lots of patriots did think so. This is from Henry Lawrence, writing to his son, John Lawrence. Henry Lawrence, at this point, was president of the Continental Congress, and John Lawrence, his son, was a lieutenant colonel, a young man on the staff of George Washington. At this point, he and Alexander Hamilton, roughly the same age, very young, were best of friends, serving on Washington's staff. It was through John Lawrence that Henry Lawrence kept abreast of what Washington's headquarters was thinking, and from John Lawrence, Washington was able to get a fairly accurate view of what Henry Lawrence was thinking and his friends in Congress were thinking. This is from Henry to John. I hinted some time ago of my discovery of party in our councils. The events which I dreaded and in many instances predicted are now coming to maturity. There's no question that Henry Lawrence thought that things were brewing in such a way that Washington was in real trouble. Things are now coming to maturity. Then there's Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin Harrison was a signer of the Declaration from Virginia, a former member of the Continental Congress, a member of its Board of War, which was the committee of Congress charged with managing the war effort. And he's writing to Robert Morris, a Pennsylvania delegate to Congress, and a man best remembered as the financier, the fiscal genius behind the American Revolutionary War effort. And he wrote to Morris, the general is fully informed of all these cabals. They prey on his constitution, sink his spirits, and will in the end, I fear, prove fatal to him. With a few words more, I shall finish this painful subject. Beware of your board of war. And it's that last phrase that we've got to consider. But when I say there were lots of people who thought Washington was really in trouble, I do mean lots. Before we return to the Board of War, let's just go across the top row here of who we're dealing with. Well, we've got Henry Lawrence. You've seen his picture, but there's Daniel Morgan, one of the true heroes of Saratoga. Alexander Hamilton, a member of Washington's staff. Lafayette, uh, also part of Washington's inner circle. Down at the bottom, you've met Benjamin Harrison, but there's Nathaniel Greene. There's John Lawrence, the young aide, the son of Henry Lawrence, Henry Knox, and of course, George Washington himself. Were these folks really paranoid? Were they grasping at straws and just making something out of nothing? Well, that remains to be seen. But for now, just consider that some of the best placed people in the Continental Army and in continental politics firmly believed that Washington was in, including Washington himself. But beware of your Board of War. Well, what was the Board of War and what did Congress mean it to do? The board was created in the middle of 1776 as a support organization. It was to take the routine administrative tasks off the back of Congress because until mid 1776, Congress was trying to run the war effort all by itself. And they couldn't do that and deal with finance, diplomacy, Indian affairs, the politics of involving 13 states. I mean, it was just too much. The Board of War was supposed to handle routine military records, correspondence, take care of equipment that wasn't being used, take care of British POWs. It was reorganized in October of 1777 with the same functions, but without delegates on it. The original Board of War was composed of congressional delegates who ran into the same trouble that the entire Congress ran into, and there was simply too many distractions. So the reorganization in October of 1777 was really an attempt to create an executive committee appointed by Congress, reporting to Congress, but not made up of actual members of Congress. So these would be experts in military affairs who devote full time to managing the war effort. But it's key. The board was never intended to deal with daily Army functions or operations. It was a support organization. That was it. But in an effort that one historian has called the Mifflin maneuver, the situation changed. And it came down to what today we would call mission creep or scope creep. What Mifflin did was, as the chief advisor to Congress, and he was a man with a great deal of influence in Congress, but he was the advisor to Congress as Congress reorganized the new Board of War. Mifflin persuaded Congress to install Horatio Gates as president of the new Board of War, making him the titular commander of the commander-in-chief. Washington would report through the Board of War, and in effect, Horatio Gates became his boss. Now, if the board had maintained the functions for which it was intended, perhaps feathers would not have been ruffled. But let me read today's military definition of mission creep, and this is right out of an Army manual. Mission creep occurs when a unit attempts to do more than is allowed in the current mandate. Translation, folks. In other words, mission creep occurs when an organization sets out to do things it originally was never tasked with doing. Now, look, mission creep isn't necessarily nefarious. It can happen when an organization sees something that it thinks it can do and goes ahead to try to do it. It's completely innocent. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Then again, there's another sort of mission creep, and that's when an organization deliberately sets out to do things for which it was never intended in an attempt to increase its power. In other words, a power grab. And what we're going to see is the Board of War undertaking what today we would call mission creep. Sometimes in business today they call it scope creep. But between October of 1777 and March of 1778, let's see what happened. The first thing we can point to is the Inspector General affair. Call it Mission Creep 1. Thomas Mifflin convinced Congress to create an office of the Inspector General. This is something that Washington wanted, and Washington had suggested it as early as October of 1777. He had met with his officers, and they wanted an officer to come up with a standardized training regime for the Army, standardized drill, standardized tactical evolutions, officer evaluations, and whatnot. This would have been an Inspector General reporting to Washington as one of his critical staff officers. That's not what Mifflin convinced Congress to do. In a really comprehensive piece of legislation, the Inspector General was to do all of those things, but it was not to be a staff officer under Washington, not in the Army chain of command. The Inspector General would have reported directly to the Board of War, and all of the training, all of the tactical evolutions, all of officer evaluations and what have you would not have gone through Washington. Washington was never consulted. It would have been the responsibility of the Board of War and Horatio Gates. And on Mifflin's advice, Thomas Conway was appointed Inspector General. Well, who was Thomas Conway? We read his letter to Gates earlier. He was a relatively competent brigadier general, but he was the junior brigadier general in the Continental Army. He was an Irish Frenchman. He was born in Ireland. As a very young child, his parents took him to France. He was fluent in French and English, which made him popular when he first came over because many of the French officers volunteering for the Continental Army did not speak English. Well, he did. And he was pretty good. Even Washington appreciated him as a brigadier early in the war. But he was ambitious. He was critical of what he considered amateurism in the American officer corps. He became an astringent critic of Washington. He also wanted to be a major general. He badly wanted to be a major general, saying he knew the business better than the other American brigadiers. And Washington was really distressed with this guy. He was importuning Congress for promotion. Washington was fighting it off. And being close to Gates and being close to Mifflin, Mifflin convinced Congress to appoint him Inspector General and to promote him to Major General. Washington almost faced a revolt of his other brigadier generals, who all were more senior to him. Washington's reaction was just split. He was really offended. He fought it off, which is beyond our story today, but the mission creep incidents continued. Critical to running an army is commissary and quartermaster operations. Commissary, the purchase and storing of supplies of all types for the Army. Quartermaster operations, inventorying them, moving them around, making sure they get where they're supposed to go. There was an established commissary department. There was an established quartermaster department. Neither one of them was functioning particularly well. When Horatio Gates took over the Board of War, he created what I've called a commissary coup. He came up with a plan, a commissary plan, completely independent of Washington and the established commissary department. He appointed people he called superintendents to go out and purchase supplies to be placed in newly created storage areas. Again, the legislation was quite comprehensive and quite particular. It actually said that the operating commissary department that reported to Washington was not to meddle with Gates's new operations. So consider this: you've got the commissary department already established out there trying to purchase supplies. You've got Gates's new superintendents out there trying to purchase supplies. Because the Army was in Pennsylvania and Pennsylvania was trying to help out, Pennsylvania had purchasing agents out trying to purchase the same supplies. You had three groups of people competing with one another. It was uh, it was mayhem in the field. It created mass confusion at a time when the Army badly needed unified command, when the Army badly needed to feed itself. There's no question, and the best historian we have of commissary operations said point blank, this was a power grab on Gates's part. Mifflin did the same thing with the quartermaster department. He came up with a plan that, in effect, would have removed quartermaster operations and the quartermaster general from Washington. And again, it fractured unity of command. So now you would have had, if Congress had had its way, or the Board of War had had its way, you would have had an inspector general who didn't report. You'd have had a commissary general who didn't report. Commissary operation that didn't. You'd have had a quartermaster general who didn't. Little by little, Washington's authority as commander of chief being whittled. We can keep going. Incident after incident, Gates would create new artillery units that would be independent of Washington's command. Henry Knox, Washington's chief of artillery, wrote just despairingly to Washington, what is Gates up to? What's going on here? Gates would move arms, munitions, and even units around without consulting. Again, this is the whole issue of unity of command. And we can go incident by incident and pile things up on this, but the point is that Gates is beginning to go, or quite early and consistently went his own way, pretty much doing things that he believed in all good faith would help the Army, but to the detriment of Washington's command authority. Perhaps the final straw, the so-called eruption into Canada. Gates's plan. In the fall of 1777 into March of 1778, what Gates wanted to do was launch another invasion from upper New York State. This was at a time when Washington is struggling to keep the Army together at Valley Forge, where Gates thought he was going to get the manpower and the supplies and the financing to do this. Remained sort of problematic. He thought he could do it, but he did not consult the commander-in-chief. The Board of War was to run this invasion. It would have been a completely separate and major operation, and Washington would have had nothing to do with it. The board began to issue orders directly to Lafayette and other commanders. They wanted Lafayette to command it, and these orders did not come through the commander-in-chief. And Washington and Lafayette, they wanted nothing to do with it, and in effect, were actually officially subordinate in obstructing what Gates was trying to do. That's another story, but listen to this. Alexander Girard, Conrad Alexander Girard, was the French minister. They didn't call him minister yet, but in effect, he was the minister, the ambassador of the French court to the Continental Congress. And his job was to keep his ear to the ground and report back to his boss, the French Foreign Minister Regent, to what was going on politically in the new United States. And the proposed Canadian invasion, Girard was convinced, and I'm quoting him, was part of the cabal against Washington. Now, Girard had no reason to report anything but the truth as he saw it. And for him to say this to the French foreign minister, what can we conclude other than that he was reporting the political reality of the day? But if we don't believe Girard, then there's Joseph Reed. Joseph Reed, an on-again, off-again power in Pennsylvania politics. He was a member of the Continental Congress at the time. Reed had been previously an aide to Washington in 1776, and he was critical of Washington. But the eruption into Canada, as he saw it, was sort of the capstone of a series of events, that Mission Creek we've been told, that threatens Washington's command. And in writing to another member of Congress, he said this: To permit power to remain in any hand upon which much depends, and at the same time to adopt measures to thwart and enfeeble its exertions, I can never agree to. And here's the line I want you to consider. Either change the hands or support them with your greatest weight. In other words, it was time to either back Washington or to replace him. And Reed, again, never a great fan of Washington as a commander, agreed that it was time to stop what was building virtually an administrative coup against the commander in chief. Time to stop all of that and back Washington, stop the criticisms. And we come back to that picture. These guys all paranoids? No, they were reacting to real events. That these real events came at the hands of Gates, Mifflin, Conway, and that they had the support of patriots elsewhere, both in and outside of Congress. That was beside the point for these men. Their commander-in-chief was, they believed, under legitimate fire, and given what I hope I've persuaded you, what you've heard, what other conclusion would they come to? So let's talk about some conclusions. Cabal was centered in the Board of War, and that was heavily influenced by Washington's critics, notably by Mifflin, Gates, and Conway, who I've called the usual suspects. The board was able to maneuver pretty freely from October 1777 to March 1778, and we've explained that as mission creep. They were never intended to do the things they attempted. The board's key initiatives struck directly at Washington's command authority. No question about this. The board would have controlled the army at Washington's. And Congress approved the board actions with very few reservations. So the board did have political support. And now there's that final question. If the threat to Washington was real, as I've insisted, how was the cabal finally resolved? How did Washington fight off his critics? And there's an answer for that. Go get the book, and it will explain everything. And if you don't want the book, but you want a copy of the paper upon which my notes today were based, it's 26 pages, don't hesitate to email me. There's my email address. But please consider Cabal, a plot against General Washington. Thank you very much.